So just a quick review, looking back, last time we talked about the pneumatic system. We looked at our pneumatic sources and control. And that was part of, remember this section, we're going to be talking about pneumatic system, and now we're talking about environmental control. And then the third kind of part of that, why I call this module 9 through 11 is pneumatic environmental control. And then the third part will be pressurization, because they all play hand in hand with one another. So environmental control system covered in, we're moving into ATA chapter 21, is, there we go, is where we get our heating, cooling, and air distribution, okay? And so for heating and cooling, we use something called a pack, and several of you got to use work with a small pack yesterday. One caveat with the lab, I really don't like the pack that they have on there. It's very different, or it's somewhat different than most other packs that are out there. So when you're doing that, one of the questions in the lab has you kind of compare and contrast that, or compare how that one works to others. What I'm going to describe in class today is going to be what you see in 99.9% of everything else, in terms of the airflow path, what the air goes through first, second, third, fourth. In addition to packs, we also are going to have, many aircraft have filtration systems. Not all aircraft have filtration, it depends. But if they have a recirculation system, recirculation is used to move air around, we're going to want to filter it as well. And so then circulation, we want to move air through the cabin, try to keep it from getting too stale in the cabin. The other part of that is for moisture management. If you don't know, when you pack 300 or 400 people or even 50 people into an airplane, you suddenly get they feel dry. Most people realize, when they get off, they get dried out by flying. That's intentional because people put out a lot of moisture. Just sitting here breathing, you're giving out, there's a lot of moisture that you're putting into the air. What's the problem with moisture in airplanes? Moisture in airplanes can result in corrosion. The big thing is corrosion. And so, well, in this scenario, what we're worried about is corrosion. And so aircraft air is kept dry on purpose in order to prevent corrosion buildup. And even without that, we would often, if we were pulling an interior out of the plane, you have your inside, the pretty inside everybody sees, right? It's really ugly, and then behind that, there's a layer of insulation, because it's very cold, but it's also for sound, right? It's very loud. And then outside of that, right, is the metal skin. Well, when we pull those insulation blankets out, first of all, they would weigh like 5 times as much as when they were brand new. And if you wring them out, you could actually wring water out of the insulation blankets a lot of times. And then on the outside of the insulation, the inside of the skin, particularly in the wintertime or when a plane's up at altitude, there was always moisture condensation between the insulation and the skin, on the inside of the skin, even with that dry air. The idea was it was set up, moisture would condense, it was designed to run down the skin. And then on the bottom of the airplane, there were actually a bunch of holes, little holes about yay big, that when the plane's pressurized, air is always blowing out of there. And so hopefully that moisture collects and gets blown out the holes on the bottom when it's pressurized in flight. But there would always be moisture in there. And so we use circulation to help minimize that as much as possible. We use it for the flight deck, for keeping our windows clear. We want to keep fog off the windows. We also want to be able to clear the flight deck in case of, say, like smoke or other chemicals, right, getting in the air. Avionics, you shove a bunch of computers in an enclosed space. You have to keep them cool somehow. And then the cargo areas. Why do we have to worry about air circulation in cargo areas? We don't do it in all cargo areas. Some cargo areas sometimes don't have air circulation. What's that? I'm hearing a few, yeah, cats and dogs, animals. We'd often there are certain cargo compartments that animals would be carried in, whether it's Fluffy and Mittens, right? Your poodle and your cat. Or, we often, some of the planes I worked on, we would always find like bird seed in the back in our cargo compartments, because they would carry like live chicks. They'd have these crates of live chicks that they would carry for farmers and stuff. And so we would find bird seed everywhere. And so we want to keep those animals alive, hopefully, from point A to point B. Good, yeah, from departure to destination. One item of note: if you can avoid putting your pets in the cargo area, I highly, highly recommend not putting pets in the cargo area if you can at all avoid it. Only, don't use. I really recommend not taking your pets on vacation that way. If you're moving and you need to do it, okay, but it is not a good experience for the animals. It stresses them out. The baggage handlers aren't always the most careful. If anything goes wrong where there could possibly be a fire, even a false alarm, they're going to cut off air supply to that, and they're going to pump stuff in there that's going to suffocate them to put the fire out. Okay, and that happens more often than you would believe or realize. We had one where the cart of chicks fell off a baggage cart. They're in like a train, fell off the baggage cart, and the baggage cart number 2, 3, and 4 ran the thing over. Right, so they aren't very careful. There was the Best in Show dog show in Florida a couple years ago. The baggage handlers said they wanted to look at this really, high-end dog. They opened the crate and they went running out on Orlando Airport. Anyone know what the problem with Orlando Airport is? Nope, there's a bigger problem. It's a swamp and they are full of alligators. They never saw the dog again. It was worth lots of money because it had just won like Best in Show at like one of the big dog shows.
I feel like with some pet dogs,
they get very anxious down there. It's dark, it's loud, everything else. So environmental control system, if you look at the whole system put together, it kind of looks like this. And we can kind of break it down over here on the left. We're going from kind of left to right. We have so on the right is our cabin. But we have our air supply here on the left, primarily coming from engines, could come from the APU. I just cut that part off because we're already done. We've already talked about pneumatic supply. We're always going to typically have 2 packs. Some aircraft have 3, depending on the size. Okay, but there's every transport aircraft I'm aware of has 2 at least. Some of your smaller airplanes, like the King Air, would have 1. That doesn't use a pack, but something that size. The slightly bigger versions use a single pack. But any of these transport ones are going to have 2, so we got 2. And those are going to create the kind of the room temperature air that goes into, you can see a border here in the middle, from our unpressurized area to our pressurized area. So technically this stuff here is all inside, it's below the cabin. And so you got all kinds of manifolds to mix and recirculate and take air everywhere. So that we can keep things properly cooled and prevent moisture buildup and all those things that we have this for. If we look closely at the pack, they look something like this. This is a little bit more complex pack. But we have hot air coming in. And essentially what the pack's going to do is it kind of works like your shower, right? Your shower has hot water going to it. And then it has cold water going to it. And then we mix, using that little valve, we mix the hot and cold water to get the water temperature you want, right? Till your roommate flushes the toilet while you're in the shower and scalds you. Right? So here we have hot air. The hot air, there's some that can be bypassed the pack. The pack is what makes cold air. We have the pack to make cold air. And then they mix back together here at the end. There's a couple places they actually mix. Some can mix some warm and cold, so you got a valve that controls how they mix. And then we send that air into, room temperature air into the aircraft. Look at that a little bit bigger. Back to that. We're sending that room temperature, the air of controlled temperature in, okay? We'll look at that in more detail. A few things here. The supply, we have to keep in mind, is not infinite. And the temperature is going to change. So at different altitudes, we're going to have different temperatures of air. So you can see here, climb, temperature is really high because the engines are up at a high power setting, right? And remember, this air is being heated not by combustion, but it's purely the compression in the engine, right? It's going through the compressor, and as it goes through the stages in the compressor, each stage causes, in addition to pressure increasing, the temperature increases. And you can see when the engine's running at high speed, it can be somewhere around 530 degrees Fahrenheit. I couldn't remember if this was in Fahrenheit or Celsius. So it's coming out pretty hot when the engine's at high power. Even at cruise, which is what the plane spends most of the time in the air at, you can see our air is right around 400 degrees. It varies a little bit with altitude, right? The higher the altitude, the thinner the air, the less compression, the colder the air may be going in. And ultimately, this temperature is partially affected by the temperature of the air outside. But a slight difference isn't going to make a huge difference over here. And then during descent, you can see that temperature drops quite drastically because the engine's throttled way back and slow. So that's the temperature part. The other thing that's affected is the amount of pressure available. And so most turbofan engines have 2 points on the compressor where bleed air can be sourced. This is kind of getting into your turbines class. We'll talk about this stuff in turbines class. But what we have is you have a port, you have 2 ports on the engine. One, if you have a compressor, right, with a bunch of stages. So here's our compressor. We got a bunch of stages, right? That is a terrible marker. Where do the markers go? I swear. Do we need to turn the lights up? Okay. Let's try to read. That one's so much better. This one was good 2 days ago. The issue isn't the money. The issue is nobody okay. Yeah, I don't want to have to clean that off. Somewhere, well. So I have markers in here. No, that's not one of the old ones. I have some markers in here that I got when I was a student that actually still work better because they're the old style ones that smell really bad, but they actually work better. They last longer. Okay, so here we go. Here's our compressor, right? There's the shaft in the middle. So air is going in the left side and it's being compressed, right? So we're gonna have a couple places we can pull compressed air off of it, right? So we have what they call a low. Here's our low pressure. It's gonna be further forward, and then our high pressure, right? So at a given engine speed, a given RPM, we're gonna have 2 different pressures available. So what this chart is showing here is the pressure available at different engine speeds. So starting with ground idle, then we got flight idle, and then all the way up to takeoff thrust. So you can see at that low pressure port near ground idle, you might have 10 PSI available, right? Maxing out at just over 100 over here at the full RPM side. Whereas the high pressure port starts about 25 PSI and can get close to 300 PSI. We don't need that much pressure to pressurize the aircraft and to run the packs and everything else. So we need flow more than anything. And so what we're trying to do is say our aircraft, like in this example, the regulated manifold pressure, the pneumatic system the aircraft needs to run the packs, to run pressurization, to run anti-ice, bleed air anti-ice, is only 45 PSI. And so, you can see at idle, below flight idle, quite get that, but we can still run stuff on the ground. It just doesn't run as well, right? But during flight, we're never going to go below that flight idle setting. Flight idle is basically where we're going to be at during descent. Okay? Still providing a certain amount of thrust. The throttles aren't pulled back to ground idle until the wheels are actually on the ground. And so, or in the flare, they'll use them in the flare sometimes. Okay. And so what's going to happen is when we're at low RPMs, we're going to pull air off that high pressure port, right? And, here we're going to get the full pressure. So at ground idle, that's why anyone ever noticed when you're on a plane, you really don't get a lot of air out of the vents when you're sitting at the gate or when they first start up, right? This is why, because you just don't have enough available. Okay, but at flight idle and above, we can make that ideal pressure that we need. Okay, and even a little bit above that, you can see we're still going to run off the high pressure side, high pressure shutoff valve, and we're going to regulate it down. We're going to have a regulator there. Can't remember what that means. NAPR. Yeah. Can't remember what NAP stands for, pressure regulating shutoff valve. So pressure regulating valve here, the PR part of NAPR SOV, pressure regulating is gonna keep this bleed air system at 45 PSI. Now you can see when we get to about mid throttle position, depends on the engine, what exact RPMs, there's going to be this switchover range right here because now the low pressure port is going to be putting out enough, putting out that 45 PSI. Okay. And it makes more sense rather than having to regulate, 100 PSI down to 45, we just take the air that's already at 45 PSI, right? And then as it continues to rise, right, rather than having to regulate 300 PSI air down to 45 PSI, we just have to regulate 110 PSI down to 45. So it switches over to taking air from the low pressure port at higher RPMs. Some aircraft you can actually, if you pay real close attention to like airflow and packs on climb out or after climb, during like engine throttle up, you can feel this happen. You can tell. Nacelle, okay. Nacelle pressure regulating shutoff valve. So that's down in the nacelle area. Okay. The big key for this discussion is it's pressure regulating. So, but I appreciate you looking that up. Where'd you find that? Just on Google. Okay, because this is an Embraer. This is like the Embraer 170, I think, is where I pulled this out of their training. Okay. So we're going to have that to try to maintain. Ideally, we're going to maintain that 5 PSI in the pneumatic bleed system to run our packs for pressure, to run pressurization, to run anti-ice and such. Okay. If we look at the pack itself, then we take this air and we're going to run it through the pack in order to create room temperature air. The part that we now have hot air available, right? So we don't have to produce hot air. We don't have to make hot air. We're just going to we have that hot air. We saw the temperatures a couple of slides ago. But we need to make cold air. And so we're going to have our pack that's going to do this. And the pack is made up of 3 kind of key main parts and then some secondary parts. So the main parts, the air cycle machine, that's what's shown here in kind of the metallic part, or there's another one down here on the bottom, has a compressor, in its simplest form, has a compressor and a turbine. Now, there are some aircraft that have 2 compressors and a turbine. Some aircraft have a compressor and a turbine and a fan. That's actually what this one has right here. Some aircraft have a compressor, 2 compressors, a turbine, and a fan. We'll look at where those come into play. But for the most part, compressor, turbine, it's kind of like a turbocharger, but in reverse. Okay. These, then we have a couple of heat exchangers. When we need to cool the air, there's a bunch of heat energy in it. That heat energy needs to go somewhere. And we can expand and contract the air. That'll cause it to heat up and cool down, but it still has the same amount of energy in it. So we're going to use a heat exchanger to take that heat, pull it out of the bleed air, and dump it overboard into the atmosphere. But we can't just pull cold air from the atmosphere because it's not at high enough pressure. So we have a heat exchanger, an air-to-air heat exchanger. And then at the end, then we got to take that hot air, which the hot air, again, is, I talked about it on Monday, the hot air is hot enough to melt ductwork. And then the cold air, which these air cycle machines at full capacity can run air well below freezing temperatures, which isn't good because that can cause ice buildup and damage them. So we never want them to get that cold, but they can be. And then we mix those 2 together to create room temperature air. So that's done by some kind of a valve, dual bypass valve, mixing valves, mixing manifolds. There's a few different terms for it and a few different ways that it can be done. But essentially, it's just like that valve in your shower that mixes the hot and the cold water. Or the sink or whatever. And then to control that, we're going to have various sensors for pressure and temperature, as well as some kind of a computer or control or logic board or logic relays on old aircraft. This was all like relay and switch driven. In order to have it run, and we can run them in an automatic mode most of the time, kind of like your thermostat. You set a temperature and your heat in your house maintains a certain temperature. Or manual mode where we can just control that valve manually as a backup or a reversionary system. So here is a super simple pack. Actually, this is one step more complicated than super simple. Super simple would have an electric fan here instead of a fan driven by the air cycle machine. So this one has a compressor and a turbine. This also drives the fan that we use for cooling, for heat removal, to dump that heat overboard into the atmosphere. And most packs are based on this design, but with a few additional components. So here is basic airflow of this is right to left. Red here, red with black arrow going in. This is our air supply. This is our hot air coming in from the bleed air system. And the first thing we're going to do is go through a heat exchanger. Okay. That's going to get rid of some of that heat. Now the yellow A right here, this air coming in A to B, this is how we're going to dump heat overboard. So A, it's pulling environmental air in. That air is going across heat exchangers. So heat exchangers allows the heat to move from the bleed air into the cooling air, but they don't mix with each other, right? Basically, simplest form of a heat exchanger is you got two metal chambers side by side, right? And that heat can go through the metal. Well, this has a bunch of fins and stuff like that. But the bleed air and the cooling air never mix, okay? If they did, if they could, the bleed air would just blow out because it's under higher pressure. So cooling air is going to pick up heat in the primary heat exchanger. That's going to be exhausted overboard. That heat, that still hot but slightly cooler air, then goes into a compressor. So what happens when we compress it right here? What's it going to do? It's going to heat back up again. We're going to take some of that energy in that. Now that energy has to come from somewhere. That energy is coming from the compressor being driven by the turbine over here. And we'll get to that in a second. So we're taking compression, by compressing it, we're taking energy, transferring energy into it again. And that goes through then a secondary heat exchanger, cools it down again. And again, some of that overboard air is picking up heat to be dumped overboard. Comes out of that heat exchanger cooler, still fairly warm, but cooler than it was at 2. And then it goes into the turbine where it expands, where the pressure is allowed to drop, and it drops significantly. And when that pressure drops, the air gets very cold. So we have cold air coming out of the turbine. And that energy that came out of it, that pressure energy, drove the turbine to drive the compressor. Right? So we've just transferred energy. We just keep transferring energy and ultimately transferring energy out and dumping it overboard into the environment. When one of these runs on the ground, you can stand next to it and there's warm air blowing out of the side of the airplane or under the belly. Okay? And it's quite a bit. 727, when we would fire that thing out, there was a lot of air. The planes I worked on had vents on the sides. The ramp agents in the winter, or the people doing baggage and stuff, they would just stand there and keep warm. And it was warm. It would keep you warm even in a cold winter. So they'd stand next to it and keep it. Well, you wouldn't stand there all day. The plane has to go somewhere. But it was a way to get a warm out. Planes there, packs are running, you can go stand there. Sometimes they would stand in front of the APU exhaust too. That wasn't very smart. That one, it's got exhaust gases, which are toxic. And 2, if the APU shells out, it's going to send metal chunks at you. So we don't want to run away. They're not coming out too fast, but still. The other part, though, is notice here when the air came in after that primary heat exchanger. Sometimes it's after the primary exchanger, sometimes it's before. We take a little bit of that hot air and we bypass the whole pack. We bypass the air cycle machine and the additional heat exchanger run. Right? And there's a little valve in this case, and that routes directly over to the output of the turbine. So that's our, what's controlling the mix. There's our shower valve there at the bottom. So we're going to control the amount of hot air, the amount of cold air, mix them together, and at 4, then it's going to head into our into the fuselage of the airplane, into the pressurized space to keep it warm or cool, provide airflow. You can see this one also drives the fan right here for the overboard air, A to B. And in that case, the reason we have that is during flight, this is almost always provided, that cooling air is usually provided by RAM, by some kind of a ram scoop, whether it's at the base of the tail or NACA scoops built into the fuselage. But on the ground, we want to be able to still run on the ground. If we don't have any airflow across the aircraft, we got to be able to create airflow across the heat exchangers. We would have cases where these fans would break, the little blades would actually break off the fan, and the packs would work fine in flight, but then they'd overheat when the airplane landed and stop moving because there was nothing to pull the heat out of them. So the heat exchangers wouldn't work and the whole pack would overheat. Here's a little bit more complicated design. Air now, this is left to right. So here's our hot air at the bottom. This one adds what's called a pre-cooler. Oftentimes the pre-cooler, on a lot of aircraft, it's actually on the engine rather than in the pack assembly. Okay. Some aircraft they put in the pack. Goes to that primary heat exchanger, goes to the compressor, goes to the secondary heat exchanger, goes to the turbine, gets really cold. Here we're also mixing in. Now this one does kind of a two-way mix. So you've got the hot air can bypass all the way around. And you've got some warm air that can also bypass. There's this, they call it a dual bypass valve. It can modulate 3 different things to get the temperature figured out. And then air goes up, out into this. Now a few other items that you see here. We have a water separator. Remember I said we don't want to send moist water into the cabin. So if there's water in it, we're going to separate it out before we send it to the cabin. Okay. The other thing here, there is another water separator here before that expansion turbine. Why do we put a water separator here? What do I say happens in the expansion turbine? It gets really cold. We don't want ice forming on this. It'll throw it out of balance and cause it to shell out. It's spinning really fast. It's a turbine. And if it gets out of balance, it'll chew itself up if that happens. So here we get rid of water. Do that. Okay. Here's our overboard cooling. You can have ram air. You can have air go through the fan. In this case, again, driven by that same turbine that's driving the compressor. Okay. By the way, this is the pack where this thing would always shell out or this valve would go bad. And then it wouldn't work well on the ground. I can tell you that. The other classes I couldn't because I use it as a troubleshooting exercise for summer. Okay. One other thing to note here is notice our water separator. We got a little hose coming off of it. And it comes down to this aspirator. We take a little bit of air pressure. This is a little venturi, like our fuel venturi. Shooting water vapor here. Why do we shoot water vapor right here? It's going to make these heat exchangers work better. We put water on them, that evaporates. It makes the heat exchanger more efficient. And so we use that as a waste product, okay? Here's our shut-off valve. We've got various, as I mentioned, overpressure temperature switches. You can see there's quite a few different switches and temp sensors in different areas to make sure it doesn't overheat, doesn't overpressure, doesn't overspeed, all that good stuff. Okay. Here's another one. This aircraft has remember I mentioned we can have multiple compressors or turbines. So there's actually 2 expansion turbines here. Compressor, and I'm not going to go necessarily through it step by step, but basic form, you see hot air bypass, air goes through here, goes through heat exchanger, gets compressed, goes through a secondary heat exchanger, goes through what's called a condenser reheater. That's like another way of transferring heat. Okay, in addition to dumping heat overboard, it kind of transfers, in addition to mechanically transferring energy like we have inside the turbine and compressor, the cycle machine. We can actually, this is another little radiator, but it's going from one part of the bleed air to another. So it's transferring hot to cold. Air comes out of that, goes through, here's a moisture collector again, using it to cool the heat exchangers. Goes up into one turbine, goes back through the condenser, comes out, goes to another turbine. There's our cold air. And then there's some bypasses here, what they call add heat valve and that. That's so that we don't get the pack so cold that ice forms. They're also known as an anti-ice valve. Again, we don't want ice forming inside of these things. That's going to cause them to shell out. Here's that dual bypass mixing valve. So you can do, cold air. You can do warm air. You can do hot air. Right? Different ways of mixing different temperature airs in order to go to the cabin. So, some are just a straight hot cold, some are kind of a 3 temperature like this. So when these are operating, most of the time they're going to be operated in automatic mode. We're going to have, again, a computer or a logic board or a logic controller, something, depending on the age of the aircraft, that's going to get readouts from all those different sensors, and it's going to control that mixing valve. The crew, really, the only thing the crew is going to do is turn it on and off, and then there's going to be something to set the temperature. Do I want it warmer? Do I want it colder? So it's kind of like, it's actually simpler than what's in your car, because your car, you can say like what vents you want it coming out of, right? Or what fan speed you got it at. This really, it's on off. and temperature. Those are really the only two adjustments that you have. Okay? Older aircraft, that was done by the flight deck crew. Newer aircraft, a lot of your newest aircraft nowadays have zones, different zones throughout the cabin. And then the flight or the cabin management system, what the flight attendants can access, they can actually control temperature from there. Okay. And so it'll control things like valves and then recirculation fans and whatnot to maintain a set temperature in the cabin. Okay. But because these play into pressurization and because it's so cold, right, at altitude, it's a lot more critical that these are working compared to the heating in your car, right? If the heat and air conditioner doesn't work in your car, you know, college student, you can't afford to fix it. You just bundle up in the winter and you call it good and have a nice scraper, you know, something to wipe your windshield off as you're going down I-94, right? Well, at negative 40, the heat, I've been in negative 40. I drove 40 minutes in negative 40 and I never got heat out of the vents because the engine never warmed up. And then I went and ski raced. I did some dumb when I was younger. Yeah. Ski racing suits are about that thick. You know, the Flanders, feels like nothing at all. Yes, I had one of those. Yes, when it's negative 40, particularly so. But no, they don't provide any insulation. They are purely, I don't know. They're there to make you go faster, but I don't know what I was thinking because I'm not a fast racer by any means. So it was more for looks. It was aesthetic, I guess. A buddy of mine had one, let me have it. I wasn't going to buy one. So manual mode is the simplest form is that the switch, and usually it's tied into the temperature control switch. You can flip it to manual. And at that point, it takes that control computer, logic board, whatever it might be, out of the system pretty much altogether. And you are able to just directly control the mixing valve. So you turn it to the hot position, you turn it towards hot and hold it, and the valve will open, you know, the hot air and maybe close off the cold air. You turn it or push it to the cold position, it closes the valve for the hot air, opens the flow of the cold air. And you just do that till the temperature feels right. Okay. You don't have an indication where the valve is at. What you typically have is some kind of an indication of what's the temperature of the air coming out, what they call duct temperature. So the air being sent to the cabin, what's its temperature? Okay, so you know, if you bump it one way or the other, you can kind of see that duct temperature change. Okay, that would be the one indication that's kind of bypassing the computer, bypassing the logic board to be able to understand what it is. And that's what I was talking about, where the cleaning crew, the gentleman on the cleaning crew, put it in manual mode, and he basically just held that switch to the full hot position until the valve went to the full hot position, and nobody was watching the duct temperature. The duct temperature got over 100 and probably, I think it was about 175 degrees, which it cools down, right? That's right at the pack. It cools down by the time it comes in the cabin. I mean, we weren't like slow roasting people in the cabin, but the cabin probably got up to about 120, 130 degrees before somebody finally came into the hangar and was like, hey, it's really hot. Can you come turn it down? Which I was surprised it lasted that long, but. Yeah, exactly. It was basically sauna plus. So, you know, it takes those in pretty much every aircraft that I'm aware of, it takes the safeties out of the equation. And so you have to monitor it and you have to have somebody who knows what the heck's going on to prevent damage. At the flip side to that is if you went full cold, it can get cold enough that you can have ice buildup. Even with the water separators and everything, you can get ice buildup in there and it can damage the turbine because of ice buildup.
Like there's a sock in there. Like if it doesn't have a sock in there, what does it do?
Have I gotten to that yet? Are you asking about the lab right now? Oh, I come to it in a minute, I think. If not, I can tell. So one is a sock is air is sent through like a fabric, a woven fabric. The air condenses on the fabric, and then when it soaks it, it just starts to drip off the bottom. Okay, that's the sock. The other style is the air is you can run it through essentially like a centrifuge. So you spin the air, and the moisture in the air gets flung to the outer walls, and then it runs down the walls into the little drain at the bottom. Okay, so that's centrifugal. And a lot of times they're a combination of the two. They have some kind of a combination of the two. Okay. So air distribution in general, when we get into the cabin, is from top to bottom. Okay. Most of your air is going to come in the top, and a lot of that, right? So we have a certain amount of air that comes out of those little vents. Those are called gaspers. And a little vent you can twist to open and close, and can kind of aim it. My kids like to aim them at each other, right? Or play with them. My oldest that can reach them, like aims all of them at my youngest, and then she yells at her. So then she shuts them all off, and then she yells at her again for shutting her air off. They're fun. But a lot of the air also is typically routed. There's usually other vents. Sometimes there's vents on the like the outsides. If you feel right along the wall, if you feel like right along the wall, you'll feel air kind of coming down the walls because it comes out. There's usually vents behind the overhead bins, or there might be vents at the top, kind of coming out the tops of the overhead bins. Right? And so the airflow generally is going to go from the top. So you can see you got tubes running up, and then it's airflow coming out the top. That air is going to go through the cabin. And then if you look along the edges of your cabin floor, oftentimes there are just little vent grates along the edges every so often. And so that air then is able to flow down and into the below deck area, below floor area. And that would be air flowing into like the avionics compartment set. Now, often there is air directly piped to those areas too, particularly avionics, to provide cooling for the instrumentation. But we send the air top to bottom. Air also tends to run from front to back, nose to tail, except really large aircraft, it may actually kind of have a couple spots it flows to. And the reason for that is in most aircraft, the outflow valves as part of the pressurization system are near the back of the airplane. They're typically near the back of the airplane, and they're typically below the floor. And so by bringing in air from above and forward and working it down and back, we get air exchange. It's going to take that air that picks up the moisture and whatnot, the moisture and the bathroom smells and all the food people bring on the airplane and everything else, and it takes that and moves it out through the outflow valves. Back in the day, it would take all the cigarette smoke with it. I never worked on planes that had it. I was too young for that. But when people could smoke on the planes, there were mechanics I worked with. They're like, yep, back in the day, we would have to rebuild the outflow valves regularly because they would get gummed up with tar and nicotine. And you would actually have brown streaks on the outside of the airplane where the outflow valves were. That would have to be cleaned off regularly. So, again, I never dealt with that, but they talked about the good old days. They liked it because a lot of them smoked and they could keep an ashtray in their toolbox and just sit there and smoke while they were, working on the fuel tanks or something. They were in the seat. Oh, yeah. You guys have probably never seen that. They were in the end of every armrest. There was an ashtray. So when I was like, 7-year-olds going to Disney World, I'd sit there and play with it and get yelled at by my mom because that thing's disgusting. Quit playing with the ashtrays, right? There still are ashtrays on the plane. Where's there an ashtray on the plane? Right by the bathroom. Oh, good. Someone's taught you that. You found it. You've seen it, right? That has to be there. That's an FAA regulation. If somebody does light up a cigarette, there's got to be somewhere to put it. That's not a trash can that can catch on fire. Okay, that's why it's still there. But yeah, they used to be in every single armrest. There'd be a little ashtray there, and then they took them out and put little blanking plates in there. And then usually they were full of like wadded up gum and stuff and gum wrappers. And no, they don't. They don't clean it after every flight. No. Yeah, they were gross. I probably picked up some, disease that I still have to this day. So anyways, front to back, rear, forward to rear, and oftentimes the flight deck kind of is somewhat isolated from the rest of the plane, so air can be routed there. Usually when you have two packs, one primarily sends air to the flight deck, one sends air to the rest of the plane. You get something big enough, 777, 747, they have 3 packs, one to the flight deck, 2 to primarily the cabin. But any pack can send air to any part of the plane. It's just where they primarily have airflow going. But at the end of the day, it all kind of mixes together. And so you can kind of see the map here. Here's where, air comes in from our pack to the back. We've got a distribution manifold. You can see this left pack has the ability to route air straight to the flight deck, compared to the right is always going to be sending to the cabin. Okay. Kind of another view, kind of showing where stuff gets air to. A little bit more complicated manifold. And again, every plane's different, so I'm not going to go through specifics. But one thing to show here, flight deck, you can see the left pack in this case has a direct line to the flight deck, as well as sending some air to the mixing manifold. Right pack goes to the mixing manifold, and then that goes out to the various parts of the airplane. Okay, and then you've also got a recirculation. So this airplane doesn't have recirculation, this one does. That's going to pull air from the compartment, filter it, run it through a fan, and send it back out. That helps to just get additional airflow and air movement. Okay. Those filters are disgusting, by the way. We would do changes on those. You'd find all kinds of fun stuff stuck in those. Hair, dead skin. You get a new one, they were nice and light. You get the old one out, and the things weighed a ton. You realize how much crap is in the air that you would be breathing. Yeah. Yeah, they were gross. So lots of wadded up hair stuck to the outside of them. Okay. So this I just have because it's got kind of a good area, it's showing the, air going to the forward and aft cargo, underfloor cargo areas, being routed to the avionics bays or electrical and equipment bays underneath the floor. Okay. Recirculation bay, here's where air is pulled in by the recirculation fan right here, and then sent to the manifold. Okay. And then again, our outflow valves right here at the very back of the plane. Does this one have a second set of outflow valves? I thought it did, but maybe not. I'm thinking of a different plane. No, this just has the rear outflow valve. Bigger planes will sometimes have a forward outflow valve. They'll have another outflow valve further forward on them. Okay. So that kind of wraps up distribution and packs. And since it's 9:47, I'm going to stop there and we'll do pressurization next time.